talked a lot about the importance of innovation during your keynote address, and one big theme that I heard was if you don't innovate, you're going to get left behind, to say the least. So talk about the importance of innovation.
So innovation is important because essentially what you just said. Mm-hmm. If you look at history, if you look at all the different companies, Amazon, with respect to the booksellers, BlackBerry, when Apple and Android came into play, went from significant majority of market share to minority market share. If you look at any industry, innovation changes the game. It changes the way businesses should be run. It changes the entire market, and society changes. External forces change. In healthcare, we have a moving regulatory environment, a moving payment model, and we have consumers who have different expectations now because the whole culture of the consumer has changed. There's the on-demand services, there's technology in your pocket, there's retail clinics, there's convenience care. People want care to be convenient, affordable, and they have higher expectations and different expectations than they once did. And it's important that we think ahead and be proactive, not reactive to it.
I was actually just going to, get to that. I found an analogy that you made really interesting. You talked about the importance of sweeping up nails and not just plugging holes. So tell me how that parlays into healthcare and maybe even specifically into revenue cycle.
Yeah, and so when I think about sweeping up nails versus plugging up holes, what we see, not just in healthcare actually, and not just in revenue cycle, probably in anything we do, is that the people who are knee deep in the job of essentially caring for that car and making sure that car is going to be able to run are going to do anything they can to keep it running. So if they see a hole in the tire, immediately they're going to plug that hole. And they see another hole, immediately they're going to plug that hole. And what we do in innovation, because we're not in the day-to-day, we're not sitting there, responsible for running that operation, is we walk into the room and we see the big picture. We see the pile of nails on the floor and kind of say, hey, can I offer you a broom? If I swept up these nails, would that work? And that's really, a very simplistic way to think about how innovation can make a difference. And once the nails are gone, then the plugging the hole exercise is over, and new and different things can be focused on, like thinking about how you're going to change that car to be more effective. Maybe you're going to turn it into a plane.
One thing that you talked about was that I think especially for small providers, small systems, they look at innovation almost as a luxury, something that might not be in their model for whatever reason. Oftentimes it's a lack of resources. And one interesting thing that you brought up was something you called the 2 pizza rule, talking about the type of people resources that you need and how that the actual picture of that might be different than what you think it is. So talk about the 2 pizza rule and kind of how it parlays into an innovation team and what you actually need.
Right, so the 2 pizza rule isn't mine, it's Amazon's. Just to be clear, don't want to plagiarize here. But the 2 pizza rule says is if you can't feed the team with 2 pizzas, your team's too big. And that basically equates to 6 to 7 people on a given team. And when teams get too big, they become less effective. They communicate less, there's confusion. What you want is an iterative, nimble approach of a team that goes out there and tackles a problem head on together.
So in other words, less can actually be more when it comes to the resources you need.
Yeah, less usually is more. So if you look at the startup community and you look at big industry, a lot of people equate huge R&D budgets that you see in these big vendors as innovation, and people tout, I'm spending this much money and I've got hundreds of people on this problem. But if you actually look at the outcome and you look at where innovation's actually happening, those big companies with those gigantic R&D company budgets are acquiring the small startups with the 6 to 7 person teams to actually bring innovation into their organization. And the biggest complaint, if you talk to any startup, is once they get brought in, the innovation tapers off, things plateau once they get into that big corporate culture with those hundreds of people. And I talked about in my talk today a lot about how the corporate culture can kind of create a level of complacency and status quo. And what these small teams and, in a sense, under-resourced companies like your startup companies have in their favor, to think about the positive side of some of the scarcity of resources, is they have the urgency, they have the burning need to deliver faster and better.
And finally, I think a big point to drive home is that innovation actually needs to be part of your organization's culture if you want to be successful in the long term. So talk about why that is.
It has to be in your DNA. Innovation isn't easy. It's what's easy is when someone recommends a change or when change is required, is to say, later, we don't have time, we have, the fire in front of me to put out. I can't be thinking about these big, broad, longer term, more transformational initiatives. So it's easy to push it off to the side. Innovation isn't easy. Innovation is hard. So if it's not in the core of what you do, it won't happen. It will be pushed aside.